Welcome, Pontiac High School, to today's lesson on presidential succession and the vice presidency. So, we're going to take some time to look at the role of the vice president in the American constitutional system. So, the Constitution and succession. Originally, in the event of death, retirement, or impeachment, the vice president, quote, assumed the powers and duties of the president. There was some question, though, over time about what that really meant. Were they still the vice president, but just had the powers of the president? Or did they become the president? Now, in the few instances that this happened, because of death in all cases, they just took the title of president and we kind of rolled with that. And over time, we kind of came to accept that was what would happen. But we didn't really clarify it until the 25th Amendment, which stated very clearly that the vice president would become the president of the United States. So it is now very clear moving forward that role. But in addition to figuring out that the vice president would be, second in line, the 25th Amendment further identified the order of succession should something tragic happen and multiple figures died in a short period of time. So after the vice president comes the Speaker of the House. So if both the president and vice president die, let's say in an attack, the Speaker of the House would become president. But if the Speaker of the House was also knocked off, it would become the President pro tempore of the Senate, or the longest serving member of the Senate would become the president. After them, the Secretary of State, and then they went through the order of cabinet members in the order in which the cabinet was created. So the most recent cabinet officials, Department of Homeland Security, would be last on this list of, I forget the exact number, but about 18 or so people that are on the formal order of succession. Formal. All right, presidential disability. Now, the constitutional amendment, it states death, retirement, or impeachment. But if the president feels that they can no longer serve as president, or if they will temporarily be unable to, the vice president acts as president until the president feels he can resume control. There's kind of a complicated process here where the president goes to his vice president, goes to his cabinet and explains this and writes out a letter. And there's a second letter that they can sign to become president again. But the cabinet has to agree to that second letter. They have to agree that the president is ready to resume office. Now, if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet feel that the president is unfit for office, but the president doesn't feel so, they can still try to move forward and get the VP made president of the United States. But it takes Congress to decide if the president should be replaced completely. So they might say on a temporary basis, replace the president. This was done under the presidency of George W. Bush in the 2000s. Just on a temporary measure, he had a surgery and for a while would be under a general anesthetic and therefore would be unable to respond in the event of an emergency. We need a president to be able to respond and respond quickly. And so temporary power was passed to Vice President Dick Cheney, who then gave it back as soon as President Bush regained his consciousness. So the vice presidency, what about it? Well, the vice president's role in American politics is, let's go with this one first. I love this quote. The office of the vice presidency is the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. That was John Adams, the very first vice president of the United States. But he also said, I am vice president. In this I am nothing, but I may be everything. So John Adams recognized that the vice presidency is not an important office, but you've got this potential where you might be a very important person, most important person in our country. The official roles of vice president, though, are very insignificant. There are only two official roles. Number one, vice president presides over the Senate. So he can attend Senate meetings, can sit at a nice fancy chair overlooking everybody else, but he actually has no power. Doesn't participate in debates, and does not vote unless the Senate is tied. If there is a tie in the Senate, the vice president can break that tie. It does not happen often, but occasionally a vice president will have to go down to the Senate and break a tie. The second one is determine the question of presidential disability. So basically, each day they have to ask themselves, is the president alive and healthy enough to do his job today? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, they're done for the day. If the answer is no, they've got a busy day ahead of them, but that doesn't happen all that often. Now, the unofficial role of the vice president. Work on my scrolling here. The unofficial role of vice president. Officially, vice presidents have as much or as little authority as the executive branch decides. The president wants to give them a lot of power and authority, they can. But most VPs, most vice presidents in American history have held virtually no power. They have done ceremonial stuff, but really done almost nothing. George W. Bush, a couple of presidents ago, president from 2000 to 2008, did not take this approach. He gave his vice president a lot of authority. Vice President Dick Cheney became one of the most powerful vice presidents that America's ever seen for the influence that he was given in leadership of particular groups and committees and whatnot. President Obama followed that up with Vice President Joe Biden also having a lot of authority. Not as much as Vice President Cheney did, but more than most VPs. We also have an election role of the vice president. Often they'll choose their VP based upon what will help them in a presidential election. For example, President Obama was perceived as being inexperienced in government. That was a perception. Well, Joe Biden had 30 years of experience in the Senate. And so he was able to balance his inexperience with the experience of Joe Biden. I also like this little cartoon here. We have Barack Obama doesn't look like all the presidents on those dollar bills. Joe Biden, on the other hand, give him some hair extensions, poof it out a little bit. Kind of looks like George Washington. So that's just kind of the idea that, balancing a little bit of experience there, a little bit of humor in that cartoon. All right, let's skip back down to the bottom. Okay, so vice presidential vacancy. What happens if there is no vice president in office? There have been 18 times, it's kind of a lot, 18 times in U.S. history where we have had no vice president. And this has been to death, resignation, or secession to the presidency. So if the president dies, the vice president becomes president, we have no vice president. Now, the 25th Amendment now allows for this office to be filled through the appointment of a new vice president. So the people don't get to vote on a new vice president. Instead, it's the President of the United States who appoints them, and then the Senate gets to approve it. So if we have no VP, we get a new VP, so long as the President and the Senate can agree. That is all for today's lesson. Thank you very much, and farewell.